Let's take a look at the construction of the Patchwork Christmas tree wall hanging. It's a delightful design. So we've created our 6 blocks. So we need to work in sections. So we're going to start with our top 2 blocks and join them down the middle. So let's put a pin in and find those corner points. And one more pin at where the star finishes so as it lines up when we're stitching. Once we're happy with that, let's go to the machine and let's stitch down to the left hand side of our row of stitching. Left hand side. Take that pin out. Let's see what that looks like. Open that up. There we go. So that's our top panels. Our middle panels do the same sort of thing. Find our corner points, put our pin through. And with the bottom one, again, find our corner points. Go to the machine, stitch to the left hand side of the perimeter stitching on the blocks. So the blocks have got a 1/2 inch seam around the edge of them. There we go. And there's our 3 sections. Now we need to join these sections together as well. First of all, let's press that seam open, press it quite firmly. Bit of steam, top press. Once the seam's been open, let's deal with the top 2 sections first. So flip the middle one up, find the corner points, stab stitch it, and then put another pin through that point, and a center point, center line on center line. Same way, stab those corner points with a pin. Center point and then stitching. There we have it. Make sure all our center lines are together. Let's just kind of cut some strips. Now we've got 2 ways of finishing our bindings. The first way, Alyssa is doing mitered corners, and she's doing a framework within a framework. So she's cutting some strips which are 1 1/4 inch wide. And then she's got some wider borders, which are 2 3/4. No, 2.5. So the measurements are within the notes, and that gives you a little bit of wriggle room, it gives you a little bit of extra. So we're going to join these 2 together. So a light on a dark, and we're going to stitch down the edges. That's pinned edge with a 1/4 inch seam. We're using our standard J foot there with the machine set at 1/4 inch from the side of the foot. This has been drawing on her hands. So we want to do this for the 4 sides of the borders, the 2 long sides, the 2 short sides. Follow the instructions for joining our strips, follow the instructions for the measurements required to cut these borders. So we've opened up the seam. You don't have to open it up, you can let it lay one way, which would be towards the smaller strip, but we've opened our seams up because it's easier to do when you're actually doing a mitered corner. So we've got our two tops and our two sides. Now we want to attach some batting. For us, we're just going to actually put some spray based on. Make sure there's something underneath your surface. If you give the top's fabric a little bit of a light iron, the spray base adheres a bit more. Let's find our center point of our block, the blocks that are joined, and the center point of our long edge. And we're going to join the narrow strip to the edge of the blocks. So let it lay flat. Just make sure those edges are exactly even, and we're going to stitch on the inside of our perimeter stitching, so it'll be a generous 1/2 inch, and don't stitch over your needle, your pen. Open that seam out. Important to keep this even so as that the contrast stripe on the border is even, and just stitch to our very last corner point. Very important to finish stitching right there. So we want to start in that position and finish in that position. So that's what we call sewing to the net, so it does not involve a seam allowance at all. And we need to do this when we are doing mitered corners. Those corners need to be free on the full size. Just marking in the continuation of that seam. Just so as that we can cut our batting back to it, because we haven't stitched it. We're cutting the batting out of that seam allowance so as it reduces bulk when the seam is actually pressed. And that's been stuck with a spray base, so we need to lift it lightly to trim it off. Reducing the bulk by doing this means that the actual borders will sit much flatter on the design. So let's press those seams all to one direction, so we're pressing the seams towards the border. So there we go, so we have that seam pressed along the edge there. So 1, 2, find our center point. Now it's important, we're just pinning those out of the way so we don't get them caught. Center point on center point, and we're sewing to the net, so we're sewing to that last corner stitch. You should have the excess of about, you should probably have about an inch excess either end at least. So that's what we call wriggle room with the length of that border. Find that corner point, don't catch the other one. Make sure it's secure by stitching a few stitches, then reversing back. Keep those edges even and stitch across the top and bottom of both ends of the wall hanging. And we're stitching, our needle was just sliding past the perimeter stitching, which is set at 1/2 inch, which is what we trimmed from. So stitching to that point, one more, back. So make sure that's nice and secure. See, we've come to that point, nice and secure there, just there. Again, finished right there. If you've got a micro stitching it over, don't panic about it. So again, we're going to just continue that line on so as we've got to know what to trim off as far as our batting goes. So it's a generous 1/2 inch. And trim that seam back. So we're peeling that open until we can run the blade of the scissors along the edge of the stitching, because there's no stitching at this present point where this is trimming. So right now we've got stitching. Give that a press. Do this both top and bottom. We're pressing that inner border fabric over the trimmed edge of the batting, so as it's even all the way through from carrying on from the quilt itself. So now we're going to fold one edge of the border to the other edge of the border, with that corner point being the point which is going to be the fundamental sitting point. So let's just pin those together. So border to border. Lightly hand press that diagonal. Just keeping those borders together. Okay, can you see that? So as it just keep those together so as it's seam on seam. So here we come with, we're going to pick up the ear and just let that sit free so as that seam is open. Just pin that into place. Just let it get away from that corner so as it creates less bulk. Now, with our ruler, we need to run that folded diagonal edge. That is our guideline for doing our mitered corner. So put the edge of the ruler against the edge of that fold and mark it with what you wish. We're just going to mark it with pen so as you can see it. And that is going to be our stitching guideline. We're going to be stitching from the point out to the edge of the border. Take our pins out, and voila, there is our mitered corner. A couple of things to do. First, before we start trimming off our seam allowance, we need to take the bulk of that batting out of that corner. So we're just going to trim back to our stitching line, get the points up into that piece of border which is turned over, snip so far and just gently pull it out. It won't. Get up as close as you can. Okay, so there's our little piece that we've pulled out. And then we need to look at this on the other side as well. Just remove that bulk of the batting. It's really important. That makes that sit much, much better. So we have a piece there which we want to just trim off our seam allowance. You can trim it with a rotary cutter or some scissors. And we're just trimming it back to 3/8 to 1/2 inch, depending on what you want. Open that seam up. Open it all the way through, then fold that corner down over the open seam. Turn it to the right side and give that a top press as well. There we have a very simple and beautiful mitered corner. Okay, there's our framing work done with our borders. This is the last chance to actually press our seams, so give them a good press so as they're closed. Now, this is actually stitching, top stitching around the inside border to keep all those layers together. We are going to ditch stitch inside that once we put our back onto the wall hanging. So we're just edge stitching, so we're in a couple, 2 or 3 millimeters. Makes everything lay flat. This is optional, you do not have to do this if you do not wish to. Coming to the end, let's find where our finish point is. And let's just neaten off our edges. So let's just check to make sure that our borders are all even. If you find that one is smaller than the other, they need to be trimmed up so as they're all the same. You'll only get a fraction off the edges, but truthfully, when you start sewing your seams, every seam you sew, you lose a 1/16 to the 1/8 of an inch for the turning of the seam. So whatever you plan your border width is usually always slightly smaller. So there we go. Let's find a piece of lining. So this backing is some craft lining, so we need to actually just ensure that we've got at least 1 3/4 inches around all sides of this backing, so as that we're going to use this as a self-binding. So let's pin all this together and then we will trim our lining up. So pin this together, then we're going to stitch in the ditch across the panels to secure them. If you've got multitude of colours, we're using a superior thread monopoly as our top stitching thread here. It's just easier to match lights and darks, so we're using the clear. We use a polyester thread as opposed to a nylon one because that means it will not melt under the iron. And now we're ditch stitching through all these layers to get the lining to sit onto our quilt. Sink our edge. And then down through the middle. Because if this needs to be washed, if you're using it as a table centre, it may need to be washed at some stage. If those seams aren't secure, they will close during the laundry process. So it's a good idea to actually stitch them in together. So we're stitching the other side of this as well. Other side of that narrow piece of binding. That seam has been opened up, so it really is a stitch in that ditch. Be very, very hard to do if you had a matching thread, because which one would you match, your light or your dark? You're going to see it whichever one you choose, you will actually see it in places. So a clear thread is ideal. Now we need to trim up our lining. So we need to trim up, so we've got 1 inch, 1 3/4 inches out from the edge. I think that rotary cutter needs a new blade. It looks like it's a very, very labouring as far as the amount of pressure that has to go onto this. We either need a harder surface or a new blade, one or the other. So all those edges are trimmed back to 1 3/4. We want to fold the area which we have just cut at 1 3/4. We want to fold it to the edge of the border that has the batting in it. So we want to fold that into the border. Now take your time doing this. And then we want to fold our folded edge onto the border and then clip it into position. The more time you take to press and get this right, the easier it will be to stitch in the end and the more even it will look. So that's our folded edge. Now let's have a look at going to a corner. Our folded edge, which has been folded onto the folded to the binding, then onto the binding, we fold that at a 45 degree. Using the point of an awl or a quick unpick helps you turn those corners. Otherwise, the fabric tends to try and pleat. So there we have a beautiful mitre. and we'll be stitching up to the point, and then down the other side we'll be pivoting on that mitered seam. Very simple square edge. And we're going to make some hangers. So we've got a 5 inch by 5 inch square. We're going to turn over the two outside edges a generous 1/2 inch. And then we're going to fold this in half again. Make sure those edges are all even. And then we're going to edge stitch and then top stitch. So our second row of stitching, move needle out to your desired width. There we have it, we have our two hangers. Fold them in half, so they end up being, put a clip in them, they'll end up being 2.5 deep. Fold them in half. Then we need to place them at the top of the quilt. So placing them, we need to measure out how wide we are. We're looking at possibly about two or so inches in from the edge. So they will be caught in with the binding, with the folded binding first. They will be caught in, and then they will be pressed up and then lightly stitched to the top of the binding. When you've got a folded binding from the back, you can't put a hanger on the back. Well, you could hand sew a hanger on the back, but it's actually more supportive if you actually catch it in the seam. Just check that. So we're 2 inches in from the edge, 2 inches from the edge. So then we want to carry on up and finish our bindings by ironing those in. So first of all, iron it to the batting, and then that press seam that's already been pressed, press that over on to the binding. So we're turning and turning, and then that turns over. You could baste those hangers in with a straight stitch just within the seam allowance if you wish, rather than having the pins there. It's up to you, whatever feels the best. Now that will be quite lumpy there, and it always looks slightly uneven, so just take your time pressing this. There we go. And that's our stitching on the back. We want to actually finish this by edge stitching our binding into place. Just a couple of millimeters in from the folded edge. People generally ask where you're going to start. I usually start at a lower side piece or at the bottom. Generally don't ever start at the top. So we're starting on the right hand lower side piece. We're just going to whiz around the edges here, sinking our needle on our mitered pleat or our turn that we have there. So when it comes to binding, if you don't use a walking foot, it is very often the case that the actual binding will creep. So whether you want to truly top stitch or edge stitch or whatever you want to do, that stitch finish is up to you. It's your choice. So there we go. We have those which we will press into position. Just give those a light pin and then we will just stitch those into position up the top. Enjoy doing the project.